I'm Mahdi Shaheeb Sher. My website is www.shaheeb.com. Excuse me. I think one of my interests in the world is the Ukraine war. I think we have had the Ukraine war for 5 years now, and it is quite an important war at the moment in the world. I think that the world currently is facing a few wars at the moment. We have the Israel war um, in the Middle East, and we also have the Ukraine war, which are two important conflicts at the moment in the world. I think this is primarily due to perhaps some of the foreign policy issues from America. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're having these new wars in the world. I think there is a kind of a disturbing pattern of maybe foreign policy kind of inconveniences coming from America at the moment, where there's like grievance of concern or upset. And I think these challenges in its foreign policy and its doctrine have caused some upset and imbalance in the world, where we're seeing new conflicts occur, such as Ukraine and the war in the Middle East with Israel. I think, in particular, with Ukraine, we have kind of Russia annexing Crimea, which is quite significant and perhaps a very serious measure to take from the part of Russia. My personal view, I think, with this is that Russia would only come to some kind of action, and maybe a serious action of this level, if there was some kind of grievance or concern with America. And I think Russia does have some grievance and concern with America at the moment. I think America is perhaps not fulfilling its obligations, commitments, and responsibilities in the world. I think, in terms of how America is behaving in the world, it does seem to be like a upset bully boy in some respect at times. But I think America is perhaps not fulfilling its obligations and commitments in the world. It's not fulfilling its responsibilities in the world. And I think because of these feelings around the world with other nations and world leaders, perhaps there is more isolation that world leaders feel and perhaps nations feel around the world. And I think this on occasion does lead to kind of a flagrance of upset and hostility that can cause war on occasion, like the Ukraine war and Israel war. So I think the world leaders around the world do need some confidence. Do need some reassurance coming from Washington that things are not out of balance, that things are not perhaps problematic as they may seem. There does need to be more reassurance coming from Washington. I think at the moment, America is kind of just taking a very flippant attitude, a very kind of disregarding and ambivalent kind of attitude towards world affairs. And its foreign policy kind of matches that kind of attitude, unfortunately. So I think there does need to be more responsibility on the part of America when it comes to issues around the world, whether it's Iran or Ukraine or Russia or the development of China and the Taiwan Straits, whether it's Australia perhaps developing its media around the world, or whether it's Canada perhaps developing more of an active role in the world. I think there are lots of new issues, new challenges in the world that the world is having to face and deal with, perhaps on occasion by itself. And America does need to take more of a proactive approach to deal with its responsibilities and lend its weight and contribution to the world, its world leaders and its nations that are always actively involved in dealing with these challenges. So I think that's one of the concerns with the Ukraine war. We should never really have had the Ukraine war. That's what it ultimately comes down to. The Ukraine war has come from an unseen and unprovoked aggression on the part of Russia. Russia annexed Crimea without any cause or reason. It hasn't provided a reason today. It only claims that there's some Russian-speaking populations in those areas, in those regions. That's the only kind of rhetoric we get from Moscow. So I think that when it comes to Russia, we're not seeing very clear arguments or reasons for why they have annexed Crimea. All we see, of course, is that Crimea has been annexed, and it's been annexed on very clear lines. Um, it's been developed with Russian sovereignty as well. I think there's a bridge that's connected Russia into Crimea, and that's a newly developed bridge that connects Russia directly with Crimea. There's also settlements and developments of Russian settlements and developments within Crimea itself. So I think Russia is laying a very sovereign claim to Crimea, which historically sets a very clear precedent, because the last time Russia invaded Crimea, we had a Crimea War involving several powers, including Russia, Australia. I think it was France and Great Britain as well. It was called the Crimea War. I think it was in 1880, around about that period. And that Crimea War was a very bloody and ruthless war. It cost a lot of lives with that war, and the war was actually attributed to the very strategic location of Crimea on the border with Russia, which allows it access to the Black Sea and potentially the Mediterranean as well. Crimea also develops a huge strategic bastion for Russia as a region that forms part of if it forms part of Russia, allows Russia to command more of Eastern Europe with Crimea. So it gives Russia some kind of a flanking position with Europe and Eastern Europe if it commands Crimea. So Crimea is strategically very important and very valuable as an area and territory to have by Russia. And I think that's why the Crimea War was hotly contested the last time we had it. And equally, I think now that Russia has annexed Crimea once again, we could equally have another war over Crimea. These things do usually develop into wars because they are hotly contested regions and territories. And Crimea does have a lot of history and background to determine that fact. And I think that we are seeing a protracted Ukraine war, uh, partly because of the annexation of Crimea. I think if we were to take the annexation of Crimea out of the equation, then we would see that the Ukraine war would be perhaps half its duration. It would be over pretty much straight away, and it wouldn't continue for the duration it is continuing. I think that the annexation of Crimea has exacerbated the war in Ukraine, and it is likely to prolong the war into a long war, especially for the position of Crimea to perhaps recover Crimea itself. And until Crimea is recovered back from Russia, I think we are likely to see further war and conflict, not just in Ukraine, but also in other parts of Eastern Europe. So I think this is a very serious situation. I think Crimea does not belong to Russia. I think Russia has illegally annexed Crimea, and I think the world should take note of that fact, and it should dispute that fact and challenge that fact. It should challenge the fact that Crimea does not belong to Russia, and I think it should argue its position and case very clearly and very well, and it should do it continually until Crimea is back as an independent territory and is not part of Russian sovereignty or part of Russian territory. And I think that is very important to determine, to clear. I think we should do that as part of the Ukraine war, and that should be discussed in any further negotiations between Western powers, including Europe and America, and any kind of peace negotiations, especially from the Trump administration in Washington as well. I think it should be discussed. The issue of Crimea should be discussed very openly with the Western powers, including the European Union, Europe, and Washington, and President Donald Trump as well. It needs to be very clearly laid out in very clear terms that Crimea does not belong to Russia, that the world wants Crimea back. It wants it back as an independent territory. It does not want it part of Russian territory anymore, and that has to be very clear from day one in any further peace negotiations we have with Russia or with any other country. I think once we can lay that clearly and factually and accurately, and we can perhaps draw the Ukraine war to a close more quickly, and it's more likely to be more practical, and it could be resolved more readily and quickly. So that is quite an important consideration. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of the Ukraine war is the annexation of Crimea and how it eventually led to the illegal invasion of Ukraine itself. And now, of course, a 5 year Ukraine war. So that's my position on the annexation of Crimea and the Ukraine war. Thank you very much.